Welcome to Catholic Homeschool Radio, where we begin conversations to help parents enrich their lives and make practical decisions for the future.
Welcome back to Catholic Homeschool Radio. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Susan Treacy, and we left off in, pretty much the 9th century when you're talking about the development of polyphony, and how it first developed along with chant.
It was really an elaboration of chant, like an added voice to the chant.
And it's so gorgeous. Do you think that started in the monasteries, or was it in the cathedrals?
Probably in the cathedrals. In fact, some of the earliest manuscripts and some of the developments of polyphony, for instance, in the one of the earliest manuscripts of two-voice, the earliest polyphony was called organum, and so one of the earliest manuscripts is known as the Worcester Fragments, which were discovered in Worcester Cathedral in England, and it's a very large manuscript of two-voice organa.
From the 9th century or
no,
the 10th?
from the 11th century. And
so they're finally writing things down.
Correct, that's right. And then a further development, in the province of Aquitaine in France, where Eleanor lived.
Of course.
And there, in that milieu, probably in the court or the monastery, cathedral, whatever it was there, right now I can't remember, there was also polyphony developed there, where there are manuscripts that still exist, and also from Compostela in Spain.
So Spain, England, France,
right,
we have evidence in the 11th century.
These, the ones in Spain and France are 12th century.
Okay.
And then we get to what's known as the Notre Dame School, and this is really quite a bit more developed, and we have a more developed rhythm. And there are two composers we know about. The only reason we know about them is because of a young Englishman, we think, who's known as Anonymous 4. And the reason he's called that
well, that's very modern sounding.
The manuscript in which he describes these composers is in a volume of several manuscripts by anonymous writers. And so he's the fourth one. So he describes the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris in the 13th century, and he describes two composers, Master Leoninus and Master Perotinus. And he describes how Master Leoninus compiled this large book of polyphony called the Magnus Liber, or the big book.
Yes.
And so these were gradual chants and alleluias, and also ornate responsories for the divine office, matins mainly, for the entire liturgical year. Oh. So it was a very large manuscript, and this would be...
Was it associated with the cathedral?
Yes.
And then, and possibly this was taken up by the Benedictines in the area, or...
in the cathedral... I'm not going to say anything about the Benedictines for the moment. But in the cathedral and in larger churches, you would have had canons regular, they are like monks in a way, because their function is to chant the divine office and celebrate Mass in this large church. Today, a living example today would be St. John Cantius Church in Chicago, where you have the Order of Canons Regular of St. John Cantius, and they chant the Liturgy of the Hours every day, and then they sing at Mass and celebrate the sacraments and all. So in Paris, Léonin, the Magnus Liber, these actually the earliest polyphony that was only set to only parts of the Gregorian chant, only the parts that would have been sung by soloists in the chant. So
Oh, I see.
usually, in the case of an Alleluia, the cantors would start it, and then the rest of the choir would come in. And so the only parts that were set to polyphony were the parts that the cantors sang. And then the rest of the piece was Gregorian chant. So anyway, so Leoninus composed a whole bunch of these things in two-voice organum. And
It was
then,
just two-voice.
So, but Perotinus was like a generation later.
Okay.
And he composed many that were three-voice and four-voice.
And how elaborate did it get? How many voices were there in
At
some
this
of the most?
time,
What was the
Well, at
progression?
this time, four would have been the most in the 13th century.
All right.
And then so you don't start to get more than four voices till really the 16th century.
All right. And now, did Bernard of Clairvaux weigh in at any time on the elaborations?
Well, that's interesting because he was a kind of a reformer, and he wanted everything to be much simpler. And so he revised the chant. So Cistercian chant is a little more austere than regular Gregorian chant.
And what century was that?
He was in the 12th, I believe.
I think so.
And if you want to hear some Cistercian chant, an album came out a number of years ago from Heiligenkreuz Abbey in Austria, which is actually I have a 2 CD set of chant from them. And there are other albums of Cistercian chant.
So can you tell the difference between Cistercian and Benedictine? Could you just listen to the chant and say, that's...
I've listened to them, and I can see some differences, but I wouldn't automatically say, well, this is Cistercian.
Okay.
There are other varieties
It's so
of chant
Cistercian of you.
for the religious orders, too, because, for instance, the Premonstratensians, the Norbertines, they have their own variety of chant, and there are modern recordings of them, too.
How far back do they go?
They actually are pretty old because
I didn't know that.
Saint Dominic was a Norbertine. He was a Premonstratensian canon, or was he an Augustinian canon? There's a lot of similarity between them because they all use the rule of Saint Augustine, and they all wore the white habit, but they varied it in various ways. And so the Dominicans also have their own variety of chant. So these would be their own chant. What most Catholic churches that use chant use the Vatican chant books published by or promoted by Rome.
All right. So Bernard of Clairvaux wanted to simplify chant. That was for the monastery. But what about? Did he have an influence on the
polyphony?
On the polyphony sung in the cathedrals or in the bishops?
I would say no. I don't really know what any polyphony connected with him, but I do know that he was always writing about things should not be too ornate.
Right.
He thought it was okay actually for the lay people who came to Mass that if it helped their devotion, it was all right. But for the monks, everything should be kept very, very, very austere and very chaste.
But yet that music that is that anyone can get on the CD was very successful, and we're not talking about the Catholic consumer, even though I'm sure many Catholics bought it, but it was very successful in the secular world.
Yeah,
and
right.
I think there's just something to chant that it just seems so authentic, and yet I don't know what I can't explain it beyond that, except that it sounds like a proper response before God.
Yeah, right.
But yet I don't know what a secularist, how he thinks of it, except that I think it moves him to a kind of meditative and peaceful state.
Many secular people describe chant as being relaxing,
or
mystical, or if only they realized that 95% of the words of chant are from the Bible.
Well, I'm sure a lot of them do, because some of these people are very smart.
Yeah.
And I think they know.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on. And, well, do you think that the polyphony started in England and then...
Oh, no, it didn't start in England.
Okay.
But that one of the early manuscripts that
Okay.
still remains.
Do you think it was in
is
France?
from England.
So was it France to England? England?
Well, of course, musicologists are like detectives.
Yes,
we work
yeah,
with
it's
the
fun.
evidence that exists, and so
you're still discovering
the
things.
treatise that contains the earliest examples of. Well, this is interesting because one of my music history students now, for her research paper, last summer she went on the AMU Classics trip to Rome, and they took a side trip to Monte Cassino Abbey.
Yes.
And she was spellbound by the manuscripts there. So she's doing her research paper for music history on a particular manuscript. And within that manuscript, it's divided into various sections. And one of the sections contains that treatise I mentioned to you. I didn't give you the name of it before, but it's called the Musica Enchiriades. It means the musical handbook. It's like a music theory textbook. And that's the
And
manuscript
that came out of England.
No, Italy.
Which one?
Italy.
Oh, okay.
The English manuscript was called the Worcester Fragments from Worcester Cathedral.
Okay.
But this Musica Enchiriades, which has the very earliest examples of, they're like musical examples in a textbook. That's really what they are. They're not actually meant to be used at Mass. But anyway, it's from Italy. So the evidence that we have shows us that the earliest examples stem from Italy. But then, of course, it's spread. The earliest examples of polyphony are from Italy, but then, of course, it's spread throughout the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
And we have manuscripts of early polyphony from Switzerland, France, Spain, England.
Well, okay, and then as time moves on, and we have the Albigensians, and et cetera, was there ever an effort to put a stop to the elaborations in the Mass?
Well, yes, actually.
Were there liturgical reformers
who
went crazy?
Of course, there's the movement of Cluny, which is in the 900s, in the 10th century, if I remember correctly, either the 9th century or the 10th century, Benedictine monastery in France, which was incredibly, it spread very all over, and there were several hundred monasteries.
The reforms of Cluny.
Yeah, but that reform tended towards more splendor in the liturgy.
Oh, it did. Okay.
But that was what Bernard of Clairvaux was. He was against that. He was later than Cluny, a little bit later than Cluny. So then you have. So things, of course, I'm taking such a big view of everything. If I studied
I know.
the liturgy in detail, there would be much more information, that gives you a fuller picture.
Right.
But, of course, the Council of Trent made a lot of reforms. One thing we did not discuss so far is the trope, which is a decoration of a chant. It's like an addition to the melody of a chant, an addition of either new words and new melody to a chant, or just a new extra bit of melody, or the addition of words to a melismatic chant that turns it into a syllabic chant.
Okay.
And so...
and that was addressed at Trent?
It was, actually, because the sequences, probably the best, there are 5 sequences that are still remain. At Trent, by the time of Trent, there were hundreds of sequences, maybe thousands even. They were very popular. So at Trent, they did away with all of the sequences except 4, which are still known today. The Easter sequence, Victimae Paschali Laudis, the Pentecost sequence, Veni Sancte Spiritus, and the Corpus Christi sequence, Lauda Sion, and the Requiem sequence, Dies Irae.
Okay.
And so those were the only four
That was a
were
pastoral
permitted.
decision, don't you think? Because
Oh, yeah.
it was just getting
Right.
too long.
Right, and like some of the Kyries had extra words added into them. I have recordings of a lot of these. It's very interesting, and it was like an efflorescence of devotion, really, because these were added texts and melodies that expanded upon the official texts of the liturgy.
And well, I can see where the musician might love that, but the people in the pews don't have an idea of when
Well,
they don't know how to
what they
pace the
thought.
Mass.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
but,
of course, they were used to going to Mass much longer
Yeah.
than we are today. But, like, for instance, when I was talking about the Notre Dame polyphony, the gradual for Christmas Day, Viderunt omnes, all the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God.
Yes.
The setting by Perotinos for 4 voices, just the first intonation lasts like 10 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
And that's before you even get to the rest of the text, of the gradual. So,
And is that done anywhere?
I don't think it's done anymore in the liturgy.
Okay.
People today wouldn't, I don't think they would be able to take it.
Right. You have to at least have something familiar, or else you can't pace yourself. I think Mass is a ritual, and people should be able to have a sense of how long they'll be on their knees, how long they'll be
Right.
standing, how long this prayer will be. I think that's an important part of ritual, that there's a
for sure.
repetition there, and there's kind of a paradigm that you fit into. Otherwise, it's just you're dependent on someone else's performance, and you have no
Right,
idea.
Right. But of course,
where
we're
it's
speaking
going.
from the standpoint of to people who live in the 21st
Right,
century.
where we have that.
Yeah.
And right. So on to the crazy stuff with the. Well, I did ask you about the Albigensians because I was wondering if their idea of the evil of the body would affect what music they would want or in the liturgy, how decorative.
I have
or,
no idea
okay.
what
I don't either. I've never
what
heard
their musical
any connection.
practices were.
Okay.
Yeah. I never even thought of it, actually. That's
well-
now you've made me curious.
Well, yeah. We've seen those influences, those puritanical influences in the church before, both
Yeah.
visually and so I would assume also with music.
Yeah. Oh, well, here's another pruning influence from Trent, which actually occurred after Trent. That Pope Pius V commissioned a revision of the chant at the time of the Council of Trent. But it didn't really get going in full force until a bit later. And so in the early 17th century, 1614, a new official edition of chant was published, which was modernized.
Okay.
The chant was truncated a lot. The very melismatic portions some of them were
Pruned a bit.
Pruned, and also the text was set in different ways. Like in a real Gregorian chant, it's very often a melisma, a long group of notes for one syllable word, might be could be set to a weak syllable of a word or a seemingly unimportant syllable of a word. So when they made this revision, they made sure that they put all the melismas on accented syllables of words. It was a function of the Renaissance humanist mindset. They thought of medieval Latin as being barbaric, and a new translation of the hymns were made, and everything was, the goal, the ideal for Latin in the Renaissance was Ciceronian Latin, and so even some of that sort of made its way into the church. And
Okay.
So it was called the Medicean edition in 1614, the official chant book of the Vatican, was a modernized and new and improved.
Did they change the pronunciations? Like instead of Veni Vidi Vinci, it was Weni Weedy Winky.
Not that I know of. I don't
Okay.
know. I don't know about the pronunciations. It would be hard to know unless you found a description of somebody
Oh, okay. All
saying
right.
it. Since of course there
I
were no
know.
recordings.
Right. All right. So then we get to the Reformation,
Yeah.
and then how were things reformed liturgically? And now I'll just use that word.
Okay. So are you talking about how the comparison of, say, the Lutheran or the Anglican liturgies
yes.
with the Catholic liturgies?
Right.
Okay, I can give
What
you,
were
and
people
Calvinist too.
Okay.
I can give you some brief ideas.
Brief,
here.
and then what the church did in response.
Yeah. So Lutherans, Martin Luther loved music, and he himself actually sang and played the lute and composed. And his favorite composer was the great Josquin des Prés, who lived from about 1450 to 1521, so just like a generation older than Luther. And so Luther thoroughly
And he was a church musician.
Josquin was.
Yes.
He was a priest musician, and he sang in the papal choir for a while. He was from Flanders or northern France, but like many composers and singers from the Low Countries, he was in high demand in Rome and in Italy, and so he worked in the papal choir and also for the court at Ferrara. But anyway, he was a great composer. So that was Martin Luther's favorite composer. But when Luther came up with his new Mass, he had two versions of the Mass. He had the Mass in Latin and Mass in German. And so for the Latin Mass, he would keep all of the chants and the polyphony and
really?
everything. For the German Mass, you could have both Latin and German. Or you could have a choice. You had lots of options. And
We've seen that.
Yeah, and so you could have a chanted introit at the beginning of Mass. You could have it as chant or polyphony. Now, say for the Kyrie, you could have a chanted Kyrie in Latin, or you could have a German hymn, which is a paraphrase of the Kyrie. Kyrie Gott Vater in Ewigkeit. Lord God, Father in eternity. Or
Now, you've just brought in hymn for the first time,
Right.
actually. So is that how, when we think of the new hymns, we think of Mighty Fortress is our God, but
Right.
you're talking about something that really is less alien to a Catholic ear.
well, it's interesting you should mention A Mighty Fortress is Our God, because we believe that was composed by Luther.
I know.
And
Okay.
Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott.
Okay.
And but there were all these hymns that were the equivalent. So instead of the Kyrie I mentioned, for the Gloria, there was the German hymn, Allein Gott in der Höhe sei to God alone be praised in the highest. Or for the Sanctus, Jesaja der Propheten geschah. It starts at the point, because the Sanctus comes from the 6th chapter of the book of the prophet Isaiah, the vision of Isaiah, of the Lord sitting high upon the throne. And the seraphim, the two seraphim, holy, holy, holy.
Yes,
So
so
in the
beautiful.
Lutheran version of the hymn, it doesn't start right with holy, holy, but it starts out with the description of Isaiah looking at the
So it's
at
more
the
of a
throne.
narrative. That's kind of interesting.
Right. And then let's see, the Credo, wir glauben all in einem Gott. We all believe in one God. There was a hymn that was an equivalent of the Credo.
Okay.
And then you had...
Why do you think he changed it? I mean, that doesn't... I mean,
Why
it
do you think
sounds
he changed what?
Well, why would he
the
change
word?
the words of the Mass?
in other words, why wasn't it a strict translation of the Mass?
Yeah. Is it? What is he after?
Well,
Is he
I think
just,
that the paraphrase, in his evangelical zeal, I think he was thinking that a paraphrase would mean more to the person in the pew, possibly.
Okay.
And then
So
the
instead, because these were all traditionally prayers that we're
Right.
offering them to God, they weren't
Right.
cast as a narrative.
Yeah.
But so I hadn't thought about that.
Right.
What he was structurally changing in what he was
right.
going
so
for.
the structure of the Mass is very similar, but of course there are important
order
things missing too.
No, they don't have the. I don't think they have the offertory. And the consecrate. Well, that's all right. We won't. We don't have to elaborate on that too much. I'm interested in the fact that he develops from a certain type of hymn.
So the Lutheran hymn popularly is known as the chorale, chorale, and the word chorale comes from German choral, choral, which actually is the German word for chant. And so because the Gregorian chant, Gregorianische Choral in German, and so the chorale was sung by the people, and the polyphony was sung by the choir. And so they had polyphony in the Lutheran Mass.
All right.
In the Anglican setting, the beautiful Anglican music that we know, we've heard lots, certainly on recordings and all, that was mainly sung, and again, it's probably true in Germany as well, but I'm not sure. But in England, it would be in the Chapel Royal of the Queen or the King, the Queen mainly, because it was by the time it started, it was Elizabeth's reign, and or in larger churches and cathedrals, that's where you heard that music. But the ordinary Church of England parish in the 16th century would have just sung metrical psalms. So these were psalms translated into English and centered in rhymed and metered verse, and they were led. They call calling out. There was a psalm leader who would call out one line of the psalm. The congregation would sing that, and then the next line. And so it was all unaccompanied metrical psalms. And this shows us the Calvinistic origin of the Church of England, because Calvin.
And it wasn't the vernacular.
Yeah, it was the vernacular.
Yeah.
Yes, and because Calvin banished every bit of ornate music from the church, from the Calvinist church, and the only thing he permitted was just the singing of the Psalms and maybe a couple of other sections. It all had to be from Holy Scripture.
And what kind of music was it?
Just very simple tunes.
They were tunes.
Like, the old 100th tune?
No.
All people that on earth do dwell.
Yeah.
That melody is from the Calvinist,
and that is
from the Geneva Psalter. And then it made its way with the English, the Puritans, who were the most, what's the word I'm thinking of? Gung-ho.
Yeah,
I can't think of the right word.
Enthusiastic.
They felt that they wanted completely to change the church in England, to a totally Calvinist model. And so many of them fled the continent. Some settled in Geneva. Some settled in Holland, from whence they went
they
to
came to Connecticut.
Right, and Massachusetts, etc. But anyway, so they built their own book of metrical psalms, modeled on the Genevan Psalter, which was in French. The psalms were metrical psalms in French. And so that famous melody was originally sung with a different psalm, Psalm 134.
Where did that music come from? What was the tradition? Was it just folk, from the folk song tradition?
Well, in the case of both the Lutheran chorale and the Calvinist metrical psalm, some of the same sources. Some were borrowed and slightly altered Gregorian chant. Some were popular hymns that had been sung before the Reformation. Say in Germany, do you know In Dulce Jubilo?
Yes.
That was a popular Catholic song, pre-Reformation melody. In fact, the tradition has it that Blessed Henry Suso, it was sung to him in a vision by the angels. He's a Dominican saint. And so I love that melody. But that was a popular religious song in Germany.
All right. And that was sung outside of Mass.
Outside of Mass. And then
So you
France,
did have, there was a popular...
Right. And some were secular melodies that then had sacred words put to them. So there was a real variety of sources for these new hymns and metrical psalms that were used by the Protestants.
And then, was it the Jesuits who introduced them to into the Mass, into the Catholic Mass? Some of the hymns, not the same hymns, but
I'm not
did
sure
they petition
if
Rome?
the credit lies with the Jesuits or not. But in Germany, hymns started to be sung at Mass, and partly because they were sung now in the Lutheran churches, and they were drawing Catholics away. So they started. So Germany has a long tradition of singing hymns at Mass. Other countries do not.
Okay.
Okay, so now we get to the Council of Trent, and I told you how all the sequences were removed.
Yes.
And that, of course, refers to not just music, but words also,
Yes.
the lyrics. But actually, the council documents themselves say relatively little about music, mainly only that music should not be secular in character. So it's just a few sentences, really. But nevertheless, the council fathers talked a lot about, it never made it into the official documents, but at the council itself, they talked a lot about the problem of the understanding of the text. And because polyphony by now had become so complex, and there was lots of imitation of voices, therefore you had people singing different words at different times, so it was hard to understand the text. So, for instance, St. Charles Borromeo, who was the Archbishop of Milan, he went all the way with this. His music master, his chapel master at the cathedral in Milan, he had him compose settings of the Mass, ordinary, the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, and Agnus Dei, that were set syllabically, like a hymn, so that the voices moved along at the same time and you could understand all the words. Of course, Palestrina is the one who's known for that the most, although he didn't do that in all of his music. So, and this was also actually, I would say, something that was a result of humanism. Both Catholics and Protestants at this time thought it was important that the words could be understood. And so that was another reason why the Protestants went for simple songs and hymns.
I see, because it was catechetical in nature, whereas it used to be strictly worship.
Yeah.
So that's a huge change in the understanding of what's going on during the Mass.
Right.
Where you're, and we're going to stop now.
Okay.
There's so much more to say.
Yeah.
And I hope we'll be able to talk again another time.
Sure.
Thank you so much,
Oh,
Susan.
my pleasure, Priscilla.
Bye-bye.
Bye.